Okej, så vi spelar in just nu och jag måste dela min skärm till Lutheransk historia. Så kan du titta min dator här. Okej.
Ja.
Okej, bra. So, I thought we would take some time. We do a lot of talking about theology and spirituality, but do something a little different for this month and talk about history. So I'm calling this From Germany to the Nordic Regions to America. So kind of seeing a little bit about how the Lutheran Church started in Germany, what its historical context was, and then how it spread to countries like Sweden and Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Iceland. And then at the very end, we'll kind of touch upon the United States. I won't go too far into the US because it's a very complicated history because each country of immigration brought their own tradition with them, but we'll touch upon that a little bit. And I'll mix in a little bit of theology in just as we go. So I'll get an agenda up here. So I'll throw up some highlights from Luther's own timeline just to get a sense of what the cultural and historical context was for him and for the theology that was going on at his time, as that kind of will give us an idea of what gave birth to the Lutheran Church. So we can see his dates up here, 1483 to 1546. So probably the biggest thing that for me that pops out at that time is that he was 9 years old when Columbus set sail from the shores of Spain and Portugal in search for India and found himself somewhere else. So Luther didn't really write about the New World, but he probably, he was an educated person, so he probably was aware that there was, new places that were being found that had already had populations on them. So that was part of his context. And he was born and died in Eisleben, which is in northeast Germany. So we'll get some history and theology there. We'll look at what I'm calling early schisms. So Lutheranism that broke off into two different branches in Germany, just to see two different forms of the Lutheran Church and how that's influenced our experience of Lutheranism today. And then get into the history of what were the politics behind the Scandinavian and the Nordic countries parting ways with the Vatican and signing on to this new Lutheran theology, the evangelists, they called them, or the confessional church. And we'll address that both within the Nordic regions and the United States. So we'll get a good mix here of history and theology. I'm not really a historian. My background's as a theologian, so I want to put up a few sources here. Most of my history references here are going to come from this book, A History of Lutheranism by Eric Griesch, who is a retired professor from Lutheran School of Theology in Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. This other book, Luther the Reformer by James Kittleson, will get Luther about that with Sweden and Denmark as they've each signed their way onto these documents. So I'm gonna change my screen here and keep an eye on the chat to see if you are back with me, but I will keep going just to keep the recording gone. So if our connection's lost, we will for sure have the recording at the end. If you jump on and you can hear me, go ahead and unmute yourself and just let me know you can hear. So great, back here. Like I said, if we do get lost, I'll keep going just so we have the recording and can refer to that afterwards. So I apologize for the connection today. Let's pull up a few highlights from Luther's life here. This is just a very abbreviated version, but we'll get an idea of the important writings that he gave. So 1483, born in Eisleben, he was born to a family of lawyers and politicians, not really having a religious life on his mind. He began his master's degree in 1505, studying law, And then he had what's often referred to as a thunderstorm, or the thunderstorm experience. He was on a road, a rural road, and got stuck in a pretty bad lightning storm, as history says it, and was so afraid for his life. And he was praying to Saint Anne that if God were to spare his life, he would turn away from his law studies and become a priest or a monk. He would join a religious order, which is exactly what happened. He moved to Erfurt in Germany and joined the Augustinian order. A couple years later, in 1507, he was ordained as a priest and celebrated his first mass. They recognized that he had sort of a political mind, probably because of his law background. So in 1510, the Augustinian order sent him to Rome for some business, to deliver paperwork, and he was quite appalled by what he found. There were brothels that were specifically dedicated to clergy. So he saw a lot of sex abuse among clergy, relics all over the place, people that barely had any money to their names, giving all that they had to the church just to go touch the bones of the apostles or pray at the tombs of important saints, and of course, purchase indulgences, which was an important part of religious life at that time, to make a donation or an offering to the church and receive a piece of paper, which then will take either a certain number of years of purgatory off your own life, or it could help free the soul of a departed or a deceased family member from purgatory. He did do those things. He did purchase an indulgence, and he did go and visit the relics, and was very disturbed by not so much the act of those things, but the financial abuse of the poor, that they gave money that they should be spending on food to the church. In 1512, he had moved to the University of Wittenberg and was made a doctor of theology in that year and began teaching. So his primary background as a theologian is as an Old Testament scholar. So he primarily taught the Old Testament, but as you can see, he gave lectures on Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. I mentioned Psalms, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews because we have those commentaries and those lectures, his notes, and actually notes from students who took classes with him. And so if you were to sign up for seminary classes, you would read these commentaries as a part of your own biblical studies. And then we get the famous date that most people are aware of when they think of Luther, is the 31st of October, 1517, the posting of the 95 Theses. He had gotten so disturbed about again, this practice, the use and abuse of indulgences, and seeing really as robbing financially from the poor. And he wanted to have a debate about it and bring the church back onto course, so to speak. So he posted the 95 Theses, which were mini like argument points as a way to engage in conversation. And they spread like wildfire due to the Gutenberg press. They were published and printed and sent all over, and they very quickly got to the Vatican. And basically the next set of many years following those postings was Luther writing and attending diets to defend the theology that he has been writing. So the rest of the timeline here is just going to give us an idea of what some of those things were. 1518, he wrote something called the Heidelberg Disputation, where he talks about the role of suffering in our spiritual life, that God actually meets us in our own suffering. Next month, on the third Sunday of April, the lecture will be on this document, the Theology of the Cross and the Heidelberg Disputation. 1520, he receives a papal bull, which is a note from basically an ultimatum from the Vatican: either recant everything you've been saying, or you're threatened with excommunication. He, of course, did not recant because he was brought later to the Diet of Worms in 1521, where they had all of his writings laid out and had him confess to those, to being the author of those, and refused to recant those. And from that moment on, there was a bounty out essentially on his head before he went into hiding for the next several years, where he continued to write and translate. We get a German mass, the first time Any mass was written in a vernacular language in 1526. In 1530, a conference presented 26 articles of faith. That's called the Augsburg Confessions. We're going to talk about that later on. But this is basically articles of faith that say what it is that this so-called new Lutheran church believes in. And that was actually put together as a collaborative project amongst many theologians. And in 1537, they formed another theological organization called the Smalcalden League, and Luther put together his own articles of faith called the Smalcald Articles, which are his non-negotiables. Under no circumstances are we to negotiate these points about justification by grace through sin, the law that points out our brokenness, but the freedom that we find in the gospel. And of course, he had some not so nice things to say about the Pope and the abuse of the papacy. So those are his sort of diehard, non-negotiable confessions. So there's a lot more that went into his biography, but those are some highlights. So we do have some takeaways that can summarize this for us. So what are the big theological contributions from Luther and his colleagues, the other reformers, that really shook apart the religious world and shaped Lutheranism and Western Christianity moving forward? So the first one is grace and justification. I talked last month about Luther's sermon on the two kinds of righteousness, and essentially a theology that says we don't do anything to deserve God's forgiveness or God's grace. It is a gift that is given to everybody. It is equally distributed to all of creation. So we receive that gift, and as a response to that, we love and serve our neighbors. That seems so common to us because that's a kind of a foundation of our religious faith, is we receive grace and we love and serve neighbors. But that was, it needed to be said at that point in history. It was not so common. He also wrote another article called The Freedom of a Christian in 1520. So this was still early on in his career, only 3 years after the 95 Theses, the continued use and abuse of the indulgences in the church. And at this point, Luther actually was naive enough to believe that the Pope had no idea that these abuses were going on, and that he needed to write a reconciliation letter to the Pope to say, I really respect you, but this is going on in the church. And if you knew what was going on, you would be appalled. We need to bring the church back to Christ. It wasn't until several years later that Luther realized that the Pope was the one that was driving the sale of the indulgences in order to build what is now known as St. Peter's Basilica, right in the heart of the Vatican. That church did not exist at Luther's time, but they were actively fundraising to build the basilica. So you can see in this letter, The Freedom of a Christian, that Luther still feels very much bound as a servant to the church, but has already been liberated by the freedom of the gospel. So the famous line that comes from that demonstrates that servanthood and freedom. He says, the Christian individual is a completely free Lord of all, subject to none. And the Christian individual is a completely dutiful servant of all, subject to all. So this is a paradox of our faith. We are free and bound by nothing, but yet we are a servant. We are bound by servanthood to each other. Luther has a small and a large catechism, both same content, but varying sizes and depths. This was huge to be able to have tools to teach the ordinary person things like the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed, and what does it mean when you go up and take communion? Not just why you should or how to confess, but why. Why is confession an important part of our life together? So those sort of tools of building faith within the house was important. And that was the intention of the small catechism, at least, was for parents to be able to spiritually raise their children. And then we get the Augsburg Confessions, which I've already spoken about. That came out in 1530 as a part of the Diet of Augsburg. It's 26 articles of faith that the new reformers or the evangelists believed in. Things like who is God? What is Christ? What is the role of bishops in the church? How do we understand communion? Those sorts of things. And that was presented, and we call those the chief articles. So to this day, those are the primary source of doctrine, of dogma within the Lutheran Church. That document plus several others were later compiled in 1580 into a book called the Book of Concord. And we'll reference both the Augsburg Confessions and the Book of Concord when we get to our Scandinavian history in just a moment. So Luther lived a long life. He died and had quite a wealthy estate that he left on to his wife, Katharina von Bora, which was very controversial. In Germany in the 16th century, it was illegal for women to own property. And women were not, could not be placed in the will of a man. But Luther was defiant against those cultural and legal norms, and she did inherit absolutely everything and ran the Luther property. But just like any big movement, when a leader or a founder dies, the shape of the movement tends to change afterwards. So we get a sort of split, two different movements within the Lutheran Church. Now, at this point in time, before Luther died, you'll see that Lutheranism already started to spread to Denmark and to Sweden, and by proxy, Norway and Finland and Iceland. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and talk about these two splits in the German church, just to get an idea, a better sense of the theological climate. Then we'll back up and look at the history, so we have a better understanding of why Lutheranism might look different in Sweden, for example, than it does here in the United States, and certainly looks different in Germany than it does in either of those countries. So we're going to pause the history timeline and move forward a little bit and then backtrack. The first movement of these is known as Orthodoxy. So this was immediately following Luther's death. There were very passionate people that were following him, and they were perhaps a little too passionate, a little too zealous, and they pretty much took Luther's movement to the extreme. So we're dubbing Orthodoxy here as the search for pure doctrine. We have to have an absolute perfect understanding and a very well thought out system of theology. And it's a very black and white movement. So this was highly political because it strove for unity. So if we have a clear teaching, then everybody can get in line with that teaching. And then countries like Germany and Denmark, which at that point were just loose provinces, could be joined together as two separate but united countries. There would be a whole place known as Germany at this point, and now a whole country known as Denmark, not just loose principalities. But you needed to have clear theology coming from the church, and everybody needed to be in line with that theology. So think unity. Everyone's got to be thinking the same thing here, because that's where, from their perspective, that's where political strength is coming from. I've already mentioned that this is the search for pure doctrine. So what is the right understanding of God? And for them, there was a right understanding, and they created these complex systems of philosophy to be able to understand, well, what do we mean when God is incarnate in the person of Christ? Which means that changes how we read our Bible. So within the realm of German Orthodoxy, biblical inerrancy was the norm. If even a single word or a punctuation in the scriptures were not absolutely true, not metaphorically true, but literally so, if just one word fell out of line, the whole Bible fell apart. So we have to read the Bible literally. So in the Gospel of Matthew, if Jesus were to say, if your right hand causes you to sin, then you cut it off, well, you get in some trouble there if you are very much clinging to a biblical inerrant perspective. So inerrancy here means without error. Because there was this complex system of creating theology, they were very much interested in philosophy, metaphysics, those sorts of things, ontology, which is the study of being. What does it mean to exist? And they were really going up against the Catholic Church of the time, which was very well educated and very philosophical. There was a resurgence here of Aristotelianism, so the philosophy of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and everything was very categorized. So God is referred to as the prime mover, this very distant, absent being that created the universe and set everything in motion. So everything that happens then, from this perspective, is a consequence of the first movement of God basically spinning the world into motion. But God is very distant. It's not an emotional God. It's basically the source of all movement here. There's an ordered reality in this philosophy. So there's this realm that we live in, and then there's the realm of the angels and realms of demons. And even within the human realm, we are at different stages of our spiritual development. Very much an obsession with metaphysics, with what happens after we die. What realm do we go to? Is God there? Is it the same realm that God dwells in, or is God's presence there and somewhere else? I mean, these complex systems were very important to them, and not just hypothesizing about it, but again, getting to what they perceive to be the one true answer. So we're looking at a very strict movement here. Polemics was a big component of this. So debating. Debate from the university was a huge aspect of Orthodoxy. I put in parentheses there, scholasticism is a method of debating, of taking a scripture verse, for example, and saying, if this is true, then A, B, and C are also true. Ironically, Luther was very much against scholasticism, because he said God is so much beyond our understanding. It's a waste of our time to debate these things. And I want to summarize this as essentially Orthodoxy is salvation through right understanding. It doesn't matter what you do or what kind of a person you are. Do you believe the right things? That's the important part for this. Do you believe the right things? I have a picture here of Johann Sebastian Bach. Actually, someone just told me about an hour and a half ago that today is Bach's birthday. So that's interesting. I didn't keep track of that. So that's fitting for us. Bach, of course, is a well-known composer from the 18th century. So he died in 1750, was a devout Lutheran. And I have him here with Orthodoxy because he, for about 30 years, worked at the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, Germany, and actually had to sign a piece of paper pledging allegiance to the Orthodox movement of Lutheranism. And so he was very much tied to that. So that is Orthodoxy. Advance the slide here. As Orthodoxy went on into about the middle of the 1700s, so we'll say between 1620 and 1650, there was a little bit of a transition. They had gotten so complex in their in their theologizing, essentially, and in their philosophy systems, that they really couldn't move too much. But they did start to dip their toes into spirituality, into mysticism, the actual experience of God in this world. So I pulled a quote here from that history book by Eric Griesch that talks about the Orthodox theologians that actually really came to start to appreciate spirituality. I don't think they ever fully adopted it, but he says that Lutheran Orthodox theologians even adopted the notion of a mystical union, which they called unio mystica in Latin, the transformation of the self through purification, resulting in a fusion of human and divine substance. This was huge for the Orthodox people because so much of their theology, as I had said, was about a distant God who was out there, and we're creations of that God, but we're not really in relationship with God that much. So for them to say there is a mystical union that says there's something of us that lives in God and there's something of God that lives in us, this was a profound thing for them to say. It took a lot of faith for them to let go of their desire for strict intellectual philosophy to say there could be something here beyond reason. If you do get a hold of that book for whatever reason of interest and read through it, I just want to point out a quick error. This is absolutely true that they did start to adopt the idea of mystical union. Grish, the author of the book, says that mystical union is condemned in those confessional writings, saying then that Lutherans actually condemn the idea or reject the idea that human and divine nature is mixed into this union. That's not true. It actually says that the Lutherans reject, it's an antithesis. So they reject the teaching that this is not true. Therefore, they are affirmative in that way. So I pulled that up here from a text in the Book of Concord called The Formula of Concord. There's more information here than you need to know, but it says, therefore we reject and condemn that not God himself, but only the gifts of God dwell in believers. So Grish actually had it backwards there. So it's a little confusing language, but the early Lutherans did believe that it's not just the creation of God that we receive, but God's self actually lives and dwells among us and in us. So it is deeply mystical. The reason that was so important for them to adopt that is because it defined this second movement of Lutheranism in Germany, which was known as Pietism. If you think about the word piety, piety is not so much what you believe, but it's how you practice your faith. It's very praxis oriented. And this was a second movement. It came a little bit later, and they were reacting against Lutheran Orthodoxy. They had seen that Orthodoxy had gotten so caught up in complex systems and were so rigid that they couldn't experience God because they were in their heads all the time. And so Pietism, I had a professor at the seminary that described it as theological liberalism. So this was the spiritually rich liberal movement within theology. Grish says that it was a second Reformation because its pioneers understood themselves to be faithful disciples of Luther. If they thought that the Orthodox movement had actually moved away from Luther, then the Pietism was an attempt to bring it back to the simple, humble foundings of the early Lutheran Church. The most important name with Pietism was a German man named Philipp Jakob Spener, who was a pastor and a theologian in Germany. And he organized a group called the Collegium Pietatis, or the Pietist Collegium, which was a group that actually met in his house. It started as clergy, but grew to several hundred people, clergy and lay people alike, to talk about spiritual formation. Spirituality was so missing in the church during this time. Whether you were a layperson sitting in church listening to a sermon, or if you were a pastor fresh out of the seminary and the university, you got a lot of theology, a lot of philosophy, but no one taught you how to pray. No one taught you about how to experience God in this very moment. So that was the role of the Collegium Pietatis, was to spiritually form each other and to talk about spirituality in the church. So they actually put together a document called the Pia Desideria, which means the path of desires, which really reads as a political manifesto in three parts. The first was diagnosing of the degeneration of the church. Here's the state that the church is in. We have spiritually poor people. Then they move, the second portion is a prognosis, and then a 6-component reform. If we are spiritually lacking, what can we do to revitalize and renew our spirituality and our faith in the church? I have the same picture of Bach here because for so many years, we assumed Bach was tied with the Orthodox Church because of his signing of that document of allegiance at the Thomaskirche. But after he died, people went through his library, and a third of the books that he had were written by Pietist theologians. And the margins were filled with his own handwriting of notes. about our spiritual lives rooted in music, and his own commentary on Luther's German translation of the Bible. And so we could really attribute Bach to either one of those. So it's sort of up to you to decide based on when you listen to Bach's music. Do you hear strict Lutheran theology, or do you hear deeply spiritually motivated and devotional music? Perhaps both. So I mentioned that book, the Pia Desideria, which again means the path of desires. The third portion of that are 6 points of reform. So let's take a look at those. The first one is a rich presence of the Word of God. That was lacking in the church, and they wanted to bring it back. They were very used to the idea of bringing the Bible to a debater's podium, and debating if the Bible says this, then here are all the things we can logically conclude about the world. But there was no devotional reading of scripture. There was no meditative reading, no praying with it. So we really can thank the Pietists for things like Bible studies. The second one was a revival of the common priesthood of all believers. This was a really important thing for Luther, was that there's no distinction between the priest who stands up there consecrating the elements and everybody else who is watching. In other religious traditions, the clergy were always elevated. They were of higher importance. But for Luther and the Pietists, as a response to that, basically saying, within the eyes of God, we are all equal. The clergy have a specific role they've been called to do, but they are not more important than anybody else that's sitting there. So a revival of the priesthood of all believers. Number 3, Christianity consists more of practice than knowledge. So you can see more explicitly how that one is a direct reaction against Orthodoxy, which said Christianity is about knowing the right things, not doing the right things. And for a Pietist, the practice was very simple. It was love of neighbor. That's what Christianity is about. Knowledge then comes second. No unnecessary theological controversies. Debate was such a huge part of the Lutheran Church, and it really got out of hand and caused a lot of smaller schisms within the church, because it really came down to whoever could argue the best was right. And if you were right, then the thought was, well, you're in right standing with God. And the Pietists really saw right through that and said, that's not true. So let's stay away from these arguments. If it wasn't theological, it could be argued elsewhere, but not in the church. And if it was theological, we could only argue about it if it was deemed an absolute necessity. A fifth one was a thorough reform of theological education, what the document called Praxis Pietatis, so pietistic praxis or practice. This is the longest section of this part, talking about actually spiritually training the clergy in the seminaries and the theology students in the universities. And then the sixth one is simple, edifying preaching. The sermon is not a place to argue points. It's not a debater's podium. You're not proving a thesis, but preaching should be simple, and it should spiritually nourish those that are listening. So we get 2 very different pictures of Lutheranism. And while the Orthodox and the Pietist movements are not really alive today, both of them have left their stain on Lutheranism. And so we get a taste of both of those today, depending on where we're coming from. So you don't have to answer this now if you're watching live, but if you're listening to this, you can think a little bit about this for yourself. What has shaped your experience of Lutheranism? Have you been more shaped, whether consciously or not, by Orthodoxy? You know, what kinds of things have your pastors and priests taught you? Has it been Orthodoxy? Have you been spiritually formed through Pietism? A little bit of both. If you came from Sweden, your answer might be different than if you came from the United States. If you've only lived in California, your answer might be very different than if you're from the Midwest. So these 2 things are very alive and still contextual today. So just a question for you to ponder for yourself, and maybe we can talk about it later too. What has shaped your experience more? So let's back up now and we'll take a peek at the history. Lutheranism very quickly, as early as the mid to late 1520s, started to spread to other Scandinavian countries. So Luther was still alive at this time, and it was a very political movement. So I want to be careful not to romanticize Lutheranism in early Scandinavian countries. To romanticize it here meaning to think that they were so enamored by this wonderful theology that really grounded us back in the gospel and the love of Christ. That was Luther's thing. He was very much motivated by that. But King Vasa of Sweden didn't become Lutheran because he liked the theology. They became Lutheran because they wanted more political control over the church around them. So that we shouldn't quite over romanticize about that. It is a very political thing, and power and money are very much involved in the spread of Lutheranism beyond Germany. For example, we get a Danish church, a national Danish church as early as 1527. That's only 10 years after Luther posted the 95 Theses, 3 years before we get any formal written theology of Lutheran faith. Remember, that was 1530. They had a Danish national church. It was led by a man named John Bugenhagen, who was appointed bishop by the King of Denmark. They adopted the Augsburg Confessions, but not the Book of Concord initially. So they didn't want to take everything that the Germans were writing because some of it was seen as German controversies. If you're Danish, why would you want to get involved in German controversies? So they said, we won't sign on to those documents, but these 26 chief articles of faith will do that. In Sweden, it was very much led by a man named Olavus Petri, which is, he's often referred to as the Martin Luther of Sweden. He studied at the same time as Luther in Wittenberg. It was very common for Scandinavian countries to send their students to Germany to study, particularly in Wittenberg. It was a very well-known theological university. So he came back and he brought a lot of the theology there. When Sweden officially made the move to Lutheranism, was known as the Uppsala Controversy. This is the political motion of this. King Vasa at the time wanted to install and ordain a new bishop in Uppsala, which was the seat of the church in Sweden, still is today. But the bishop was of a Lutheran background. He was not ordained in the Catholic Church, but he really wanted this man to be bishop. And the Vatican sent a response and said, no, if you need a bishop in Uppsala, they have to be ordained in the Roman Catholic rite. And so that was the straw that broke the camel's back, I guess you could say. And Sweden officially became Lutheran at that point. Not terribly unlike the Church of England, which was about whether or not the king could divorce his wife. So again, these aren't theological motivations behind this. They're political, personal, financial things. Sweden adopted the entire Book of Concord. And an interesting note here, in 1629, Estonia became a part of Sweden, became a sort of a territory of Sweden, which is a huge reason why the Baltic countries are Lutheran to this day, countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Finland by default became Lutheran because at that point they were a territory of Sweden, but they still had their own rich history. A man named Michael Agricola was very close with Luther. He was Finnish and studied with Luther. Luther was his teacher. And he was so enamored by the theology of Lutheranism. He fell in love with it and desperately wanted to take this theology back home to his people in Finland. But at this point, Finnish was not, it was a spoken language only. There was no writing system and no alphabet, and therefore no way of writing or translating documents into Finnish. So Agricola, this was in the 1500s, created the alphabet for Finnish and their own writing system. So Finnish has only been a written language for 500 years. So he created this system purely for the sake of bringing this theology that he loved back to his people. He was eventually a bishop in Finland. But of course, if you were a bishop or a priest in Finland, you had to be approved and appointed by the Swedish king. And then the other two countries we'll just briefly say, Norway and Iceland became Lutheran via Denmark. They were both a part of Denmark, and so they were both, their leaders had to be approved by the King of Denmark, although they could translate the Bible into their own languages. So we do have early copies of the New Testament in both Norwegian and Icelandic. In fact, there is an old copy of the Icelandic Bible, which is the oldest written Icelandic we have post-Viking era. So that, again, 500 years ago, not that long. So it's quite interesting to take a peek at some of this history. So again, very political early on. So Orthodoxy was king during this day. So that very much formed the way that Lutheranism adapted to Scandinavian and Nordic life. It was a way to unite these countries together under a common creed, common language, with a very clear hierarchical system. Another thing I'll say before we take a peek at the United States, which is the US, which is our last portion of the lecture today, is that the Lutheran Church saw a reversal in power here from the pre-Reformation Church. And this was one of Luther's issues. The church in his time was the most authoritative institution in Europe, at least in Western Europe. So the church had its hands dirty in politics and had so much authority over politics and the kings and princes. And so, you know, a king had to be ordained and installed by the church, for example. So the bishops had all the power here, and the church could deeply influence politics and laws. And then in the Lutheran church in these countries, we saw a huge reversal, a flip of that, where we see for the first time state churches. And some of these countries still have state churches. Then the church was under the authority of the state. So now instead of the bishops being the top people in charge, it was the king. And the king then had to oversee the bishops and appoint bishops. And so the state had influence on the church rather than the church having influence on the state. So it was a little bit of a different world than Luther lived and grew up in. But if you have ever spent time in Scandinavia, you'll see even where the state church is not super popular anymore, that most of these countries have parted ways from that. It's still very much a part of the cultural understanding of the church. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to go too deeply into American history here because it's very complex and it's not enough time. But I do want to talk just a little bit, just to highlight some of the complexities and how we got to the state of the Lutheran Church in the US today. But as you can imagine, it's a religion of immigrants. Just like anything that is a non-Indigenous tradition here. It's a tradition of immigrants, and so it did not exist in this country until we started to see immigration from places like Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Germany. The Danes came too in smaller numbers and a little bit later, but those were the big ones: Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Germany. And when they came over, the Scandinavians came first. And you'll see on this chart here, I know it might be kind of small, but you'll see there's essentially two columns here. So we get Lutheran Confessionalism 1, Theology of Neo-Lutheranism. This is where you're going to find a lot of the Scandinavian churches. And then you have Lutheran Confessionalism 2, Theology of Old Lutheranism. This is very German in its influence. So the Scandinavians come, they form their own towns and churches, and they basically stick in their own ethnic and national groups with their own languages, but they're not closed off to each other, even though they're their own communities, but they're very much influenced and in conversation with each other and with non-Lutheran churches. So there's early ecumenical dialogue going on. which when the Germans came over, they were not happy about. Remember Orthodoxy, Germans came over and they very much saw that the Lutheran Church at that point in the United States had too much parted ways with traditional Orthodox conservative theology. So when the Germans came over and started their churches, they built their own seminaries and their own theology schools and universities, which then turned into their own denominations. So that's why we have what this chart is calling Confessionalism 1 and Confessionalism 2. So if you know anything about American Lutheranism, let's take a peek at Confessionalism 2. We'll see down here, you get Missouri. This is essentially where we get things like the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Church. To this day, these are still very orthodoxy-driven communities, very conservative, both in their theology and in their social practices. So these denominations do not ordain women. There's no recognition of LGBTQ relationships, marriages, certainly no same-sex priests or pastors, or same-sex married priests or pastors. But even those things on this side, and the Scandinavian more liberal side, that's very new. So you'll see lots of different things. Basically, what I want to highlight here is, look at right here. So I'm looking at this line, 1958, where my mouse is. Each of these abbreviations stands for a separate church. So at some point in American Lutheran history, there were hundreds of independent Lutheran denominations that came over from different countries. They split, they became their own, very complex. And over time, they merged together to form new churches. So if you look here in 1958, you get the National Lutheran Church, the United Lutheran Church of America, Augustana Synod, which is the Old Swedish Synod, Suomi, which is the Finnish Synod, American Evangelical Lutheran Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church, American Lutheran Church, United Evangelical Lutheran Church. So you get all of these different denominations that pretty much are theologically the same, but they have their own politics and their own practices. And in 1988, they came together to form what's now known as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is the largest Lutheran church. So you can see that Lutheranism here, even to this day, where we only have a few Lutheran denominations, is so diverse because just the ELCA is the result of several mergers that go back at least 200 years. And each of those mergers are bringing with them different politics, different polities, different ways of doing and being church, different forms of administration. Each of those churches had a different view of the role of the bishop and what kind of authority the bishop had. So to this day, there isn't a big, there's not as much of a uniting force as you might see in Svenska Kyrkan, for example. So it's a little bit more diverse for those reasons. So there's much more that could be said, but I think I'll leave it at that without getting into too much more. So just as a way to wrap this all up, you know, there's not a single definite answer to what does it mean to be Lutheran. I think sometimes we like to reduce things down into a single theological idea, or we like to say Lutherans do this or Lutherans don't do this, and it's not really true. Each of these different churches and denominations have their own history, and as we can see, even just looking at Orthodoxy and Pietism, those are on opposite ends of the spectrums. Do Lutherans believe that the Bible is literally true, or do Lutherans believe it's inspired and is rich with metaphor and is based in a time pre-modern science and modern philosophy? Well, depending on what end of the spectrum you are in Lutheranism, you could go on either end of those points or anywhere in the middle. So I would like to say that Lutheranism is a theological identity rooted in justification by grace. We can confidently say that. And anything else, any other stuff you fill into that question, what does it mean to be a Lutheran, is going to be not only specific to you and your background, but the church you're a part of and the background and history of that church, where you came from, the country that was there, the language that was spoken, the time and history it developed. So I think we can hang our hats on justification by grace and trust that God is present with us in all of this stuff that's going on, and that we have each other as a church, but everything else is just par for the course that we will learn and adapt as we go on. So that is a very, very brief understanding of how Lutheranism went from Germany to the Nordic regions to the United States. I'm going to stop screen share here and just jump back to you all on Zoom. And I'm going to stop this.